minutes.
Okay, great. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. I do apologize, everybody, that I will go off camera just because my internet has been spotty, but I will be back on camera for the Q&A. So hopefully by then my internet's a little bit stable, but I'm going to go ahead.
Hey, sorry,
yes.
Beatriz, before you get started, will you stop and restart your share? Because it's something happened and it's yeah.
Okay. Let's try to
Zoom happened.
The Zoom happened.
Yes.
Okay, how does that work?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and go off camera. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to today's panel. I'd like to thank the PAMLA and our panel organizers for organizing today's presentation. My presentation today will discuss the different perspectives posed by Chicano and Mexican authors of US-Mexico detective fiction. I explore how Rolando Hinojosa's Ask a Policeman and Jose Salvador Ruiz's Nepantla PI characterize the border cities and the production of crime that invades the respective border towns. Both novels demonstrate the neoliberal changes that result in human and drug trafficking as the form of crime occurring across border towns in the late 20th century and early 21st century. I frame my discussion using Henry Lefebvre and David Harvey's notion of the theory of production of space. I developed my own framework using the key term, the production of crime, to emphasize the socioeconomic and political policies as processes that enable criminal behavior across the border. I argue that both novels point to these processes as quote unquote criminals that siege border towns as they present different forms of justice that aim to prevail against these processes in the US-Mexico border. Before I continue with my analysis of the detective novels, I'd like to briefly discuss what I mean by the production of crime. Henry Lefebvre and David Harvey are among many cultural geographers, urban studies, and border studies, and other theorists who aim to emphasize space as a process rather than a point on a map. These theorists consider different scales in which processes occur, such as the state, the city, and even the body. For purposes of my presentation, I focus on Lefebvre and Harvey's notions of space through processes that occur in the city. Go ahead and switch. City. I interrogate these processes by examining the socioeconomic and political policies that facilitate criminal activities by the police, vigilantes, and city dwellers. Set in the 1980s and early 2000s, these detective novels allow us to discuss how capitalist societies, both liberal and neoliberal markets, promote Black markets that thrive on the trafficking of human bodies and illegal substances. My analysis of these novels explores the production of crime as a relationship between the state's macro, socioeconomic, and political policies and the social spaces it produces. Henry Lefebvre famously coined that social space is a social product and vice versa. Lefebvre's complex analytical structure of the production of space specifies different levels and modes of space, given his analysis of the, quote, relations of production in terms of the divisions of labor and its organization in the form of hierarchical social functions. This Marxist underpinning brings to light how social spaces are influenced by socioeconomic political policies and vice versa. I use the term production of crime as a means to show how this process involves criminal behavior by the state and corporate tycoons who are at the top of the hierarchy of the hierarchical social function within these processes. I now turn to the detective novels. I'll provide an analysis of Ask a Policeman and Nepantla PI. After my analysis of both novels, I'll provide a cross-analysis and comparison of the novels as my concluding thoughts. So in this slide, a little bit of the production of crime, and I'm going to go ahead and now move to Ask a Policeman. Ask a Policeman by Rolando Hinojosa Smith is the second detective novel in the two-book series set in Cleo City, near the Rio Grande in Texas. The police procedural follows the director of the Belkin Homicide Unit. His name is Rafa Buenrostro, as he is investigating the Gomez's narco gang activities. As chief director, Buenrostro is tasked with investigations of the Gomez's family, drug trafficking and money laundering in the American border city around the 1970s. Buenrostro collaborates with the Mexican police to track the Gomez's illegal activities across the US-Mexico border. Rolando Hinojosa illustrates the production of crime as the Gomez's supply of illegal drugs to an American clientele that demands this product. My analysis of Ask a Policeman considers how the late capitalist period informs the social spaces narrated by the police procedural with specific references to how crimes occurring at the border are solved. In the novel, we see the police unit investigate different places around the city. The action begins with Lee Gomez's brother and nephews coordinating an escape for their father and brother so that he can return to the drug business. Unaware that there's a treason going on, Buenrostro continues to investigate Lee's escape and a series of new shootings and murders in Balkan County. So what Buenrostro doesn't know is that although Lee Gomez is being helped to escape from jail, his brother is actually scheming a way to kill him and anybody who tries to take over the drug business that he's been sort of handling while Lee Gomez has been in prison. So as Buenrostro tries to investigate this trafficking business, he has to collaborate with Lucentina, the new captain of the Borrones police in Mexico. So both of them are working together now to track Lee Gomez and his brother and the twins who are his sons as they're kind of doing their drug trafficking business across the border. So I begin my analysis because this is a full chapter of my dissertation. For today's presentation, I begin my analysis in one of the scenes in the novel where Buenrostro and the unit are actually investigating a murder at a yacht party that might be linked to Lee Gomez or one of the twin brothers. So at the crime scene, some of the clues that the investigation team finds are a white Jimmy, a Mazda, and a guest list to the yacht party. Detective Dorson describes the mess left inside the yacht party, noting that the cocaine dust in the room and the smell of marijuana remained as strong as ever in the enclosed quarters. Buenrostro's detectives learned that Rwanda and Winona have this yacht party every week. The yacht party is a space of American drug consumerism that is being supplied by the traffickers like the Gomez's. The police already have clues pointing to one of the Gomez's owning that white Jimmy, but this weekly social scene invites the upper middle class individuals in Balkan County to come to this space for debauchery where drugs heighten their get together. Unfortunately, this scene does not give Buenrostro any evidence that the Gomez's are linked to the yacht party. The investigative unit must continue to find evidence and track the Gomez's movements across the border. Still, the novel shows us how the production of crime is a process that also occurs on the American side of the border. American consumerism drives this black market across the US-Mexico border. The production of crime depicted in the detective novel is this unofficial market of supply and demand by American drug consumerism and Mexican producers and distributors. Furthermore, the Gomez's drug trafficking business leads to other forms of capitalist schemes that augment the production of crime in the US-Mexico border. As Buenrostro aims to track the whereabouts and movements of the Gomez's, we learned that not only are they monitored through their border crossing, but through their monetary transactions across the border. Buenrostro's team turns to checking the Gomez's bank accounts in Clell City and Barrones, showing them the billions of dollars stored in small amounts in different banks across the US-Mexico border. Social theorist Robert J. Bunker reviews narco gangs and cartels' economic activity, stating that ultimately the goal is to use financial tricks and ploys like small bank deposits and wire transfers to legitimize drug proceeds by getting them into the US and other countries' financial systems. In the novel, Detective Dorson threatens the banker by saying, I imagine it is, but let's cut the crap, Mr. Vice President. Will you cooperate or not? So here he's talking to the vice president of the bank. It is as simple as that. I can come by with a subpoena and a federal bank officer, and I wouldn't be above bringing a reporter from the enterprise. Dorson threatens the vice president through different angles: a legal subpoena, a public announcement on the enterprise. The law functions to keep some form of order in society. In this way, the police succeed in making the bank comply. Furthermore, the police detective can call upon to continue to maintain an ethos of legality that contests the narco gangs' corruption of Balkan County banks and even other spaces across the US-Mexico border. I now shift to Nepantla PI, which takes place in the early 2000s as Nepantla investigates a homicide deemed a homosexual crime and uncovers how the thief of police orchestrated this crime in order to lead the Mexican prostitution ring against the Russian mafia. The detective Nepantla navigates the border towns of Calexico and Imperial Valley, investigating a homicide that leads to a larger case involving the exploitation of cheap labor by Walmart and the competing prostitution rings of the Mexican and Russian mafias. The production of criminal space exposed in Nepantla PI depends on a smaller interrelated level in which the state, the local police, and new social spaces contribute to the commodification of sexualities, illegal substances, and the exploitation of cheap labor. Perales and Davila, the Mexicali police officers, incorporate themselves into the business of trafficking. Perales uses the murder of Emilio to stage the crime at La Coartada bar to incriminate Cabeza de Vaca, a Mexican narco. Nepantla, the PI investigating this crime, explains, aquí sí entra Perales porque según el Cerrullo, este vato es socio del Topolobambo y pues él al eliminar a Cabeza de Vaca se queda con la libélula VIP, los dos. Nightclubs serve as a part of the distribution centers for trafficking of women and drugs. By controlling these places, Mexican narcos and other criminals can also control the city. Nepantla's primary investigation of Emilio's death leads him to study Mexicali's police unit and its procedures. He finds that the police criminalize gay men whose sexual activities are included in the production of crime that hinges on the commodification of sexualities at the border. Perales, the lead police investigator, is presented as a homophobic, machista police officer. The novel also reveals that the police taxes not only rely on criminalizing and faking murder cases, they use commodified women as bribes to buy off individuals. The prostitution ring rivalry between the Russian mafia and the Mexican narcos explains how Emilio died. It was the motel manager that confused the prostitution rings. Two clienteles at the hotel requested different prostitutes, one Mexican and the other Russian. Nepantla's friends reveals the confusion that that the manager had confused the request by the two different rooms. Furthermore, migrant workers find their compensation in the purchase of these women in prostitution rings. This social condition is facilitated through a neoliberal logic that promotes the exploitation of labor and women's bodies. The novel references this condition when Nepantla finds out from his friend Chore that messages KGB are another way of soliciting prostitutes from the local newspaper. Emilio's death represents the production of crime and the violence that ensues around Mexicali. It shows us how the police, narcos, and mafia invade different spaces around the city. The production of crime hinges on the transnational illegal trafficking of women. Mexicali's underworld is presented as a social space in which gay bars, strip clubs, and other bars form part of the distribution centers where sexualized bodies are criminalized and trafficked. Let me see. So here are some concluding remarks to both novels. The detective works by Rolando Hinojosa and Jose Salvador Ruiz provide examples of two different subgenres within detective fiction. Rolando Hinojosa's Ask a Policeman exemplifies the police procedural, while Jose Salvador Ruiz follows the conventions of the subgenre La Novela Postpolicíaca, which is a variant of La Novela Policíaca, which is basically following the conventions of a PI. Both genres attempt to depict different styles of investigations to explore how crimes are produced and solved. The police procedural typically focuses on the police force as a collaborative force that restores social order. So in the police procedural, we believe that the social order can be fixed and can be changed. There's nothing wrong with the social order. But La Novela Postpolicíaca, what Nepantla PI, this novel, is trying to do is challenge and say that the social order is demonstrated is actually innately corrupt. So society, the social order that we see already it cannot be restored because it's already corrupt. So something more has to be done. We have to understand what is it that corrupts society, and how can we fix it? These works provide two polar perspectives on how one can achieve justice in the US-Mexico border, where the production of crime or systemic processes siege the city. The framework of production of crime allows us to consider the sociopolitical commitment of Chicano and Mexican authors depicting realist processes that invade the US-Mexico border. They adapt the conventions of detective genre to describe their respective societies, providing counter narratives and spaces to contest and lead into different ways of understanding these processes and how we can understand the social order and interventions that we can make in the US-Mexico border. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Beatriz. A little virtual round of applause. All right. So next, Angelica Barraza will present her paper entitled Chicanismo, Time Against Nation Time.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I want to echo Beatriz's gratitude and thanks for everyone involved in gathering us here today to talk about the subject that I'm sure is dear to many of us, Latinx literature and culture. My paper today takes the form of a close reading of a poem that I've just been chewing on for months now. And I'm going to begin by pulling from the modernist poet William Carlos Williams, who said that there are no ideas but in things. And forgive me, I'm actually going to use his words somewhat out of context. He said them in a poem and was likely referring to the Imagist movement of which he was a part, which my paper is not about. But this famous statement, I think, is an excellent, succinct way of describing how one might look to objects, material things, works of art, etc., to think through complex ideas and feelings. A great example of this being in Gloria Anzaldúa's Borderlands, in case you've heard of it, when she visits the Museum of Natural History in New York City and sees for the first time the fierce, monstrous, beautiful Aztec statue of Coatlicue. And it is through her study and meditation upon the features of the statue that the foundations of her work on the Coatlicue state take shape. So theory emerging from and intimately tethered to art, which is my favorite kind of theory and also my favorite kind of art. And for my paper, I want to look at a poem by the contemporary Chicana poet Vanessa Angelica Birreal to think through legacies of colonial violence, temporality, and history. And it's a poem, yes, but it does not start and stop at language, which, a written form of thought. It's visual, and I posit a material art object that, like the statue of Coatlicue, is an embodiment or performance or a physical manifestation of the ideas and also feelings I'm trying to work through. So now I'm actually going to bring up the poem, which is titled F equals root future. And in case you're unfamiliar with this poem, I'm actually going to give you all about a minute to look it over and read it, experience it before I dive in. So let me, and I guess I'll probably also turn off my video as well, just to make sure that it doesn't, oops. Can everyone see the poem? Okay, great. Okay, so I'll scroll back up to the title. Okay. So visually speaking, we have the title, F equals root future, that takes the form of a mathematical equation. Product of root multiplied by the product of future equals F. Only there is a limit to what the equation can produce or solve. Right? We don't have all of the information to calculate the actual answer. So both root and future stand irreducible and F unsolvable. And turning to the poem itself, we see that it takes the approximate form of a graph. So the x-axis, the horizontal line, if you can see my cursor here, it was a long time before I'd taken a geometry class, so I had to look up what the x and the y was. So the x-axis, the horizontal line, is a timeline of which we're all familiar and conditioned to expect. Only instead of illustrating the neat continuous line from past to future, extending indefinitely in both directions on either side, we have futureless past on the one end and real time on the other. And futureless past is somewhat oxymoronic. It's a past thwarted of futurity, something that was, that will not or cannot endure or continue, which at first reads something like a riddle, like what is and won't be. Also note that the line for futureless past is gray and not continuous. It is dashed, permeable, and porous, juxtapose the very solid, thick black definitiveness of the line of real time. And real time, time noun, here being modified by the adjective real, the very need to identify some time or demarcate some time as real time suggests that there are other times that are not real. And the Oxford definition of real is actually existing as a thing or occurring in fact. And it lists as a synonym the word historical. So unreal time, if we're defining in opposition, would be something that either doesn't actually exist or that exists and occurs, but does not do so in fact. It is not historical. And the simple existence of unreal time challenges the master narrative of history insofar as unreal time acknowledges and invites or opens up the possibility for narratives outside of historical real time's totalizing purview to exist. So this y-axis here, the vertical line, is labeled prime meridian of universal time Royal Observatory, which is unique spatialization of time, prime meridian being the physical material starting point at which we begin to measure the earth, usually east to west. And here it is the starting point of time universal, time upon which all are mutually agreed and affected, which could be read origin, which is where the X and the Y intersect here. Origin, the meeting point of the X and Y axis, is the beginning of the world, right? The unified beginning of time and space. Though, importantly, whose beginning is it? We have the specter of the Royal Conservancy looming over the Y-axis, Conservancy being an entity dedicated to the preservation of something. The royals are interested in preserving something. Sound familiar? And also at the origin, the beginning of the world, where real time meets universal time, this is where history becomes universal. It is a construct that affects or is done to or is applicable to all. So the convergence of these lines illustrates the verbness of time, a linear teleological self-affirming project, which is at once the project of history. And here I'm going to briefly turn to Sylvia Wynter and Edward Lisette to help think through the convergence of time, history, and literary forms, and also to help contextualize the work I believe is Virial is doing. So Sylvia Wynter in Novel and History, Plot and Plantation, as the essay's title suggests, she draws connections between the literary forms or devices such as the novel, plot, linearity, all of which are contingent upon the timeline, with history as nation and world building project. So she traces the origins of these forms to the colonization of the Americas and the emergence of a market economy. She claims that these entwined events and the world historical changes they instituted are co-eval with the form of the novel, whose fictive qualities lay the foundation for the fictions of history that erase the violence of primitive accumulation. And Edward Lisette similarly critiques the complicity of traditional literary forms, specifically the clarity of linear narrative, and indeed the clarity of the organizational structure of a timeline and what it promises, right? And their tacit endorsement of Renaissance and Enlightenment knowledge politics. He challenges that for writers of color, quote, the production of texts must also produce history, not in its capacity to facilitate some happening, but in its ability to raise a concealed world to the level of consciousness. So returning to the poem, Real Time, Year One, if you see my cursor here, it's patrilineal, right? The year in which history begins, in which the official archive begins collecting, the moment collective memory begins remembering, is the conquest of the Americas, right? Here we have conquest, 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 all in demanding capital letters. And as Winter argues, it is conquest that activates linearity as a formal hallucination of progress. It even states that, quote, let's see, before the ship's arrival, there is no history, that the indigenous people occupying the Americas, and there are footprints recently found in New Mexico that were dated to be 23,000 years old, are not capable of producing history because the function of history itself, its foundation, is to erase the very violence wielded against them. And if we go to the left side of this poem, to Futureless Past, we see it is framed differently. As opposed to patrilineal, it is matrilineal. And it says in all capital letters that this time does not exist, which does not mean it didn't happen. It means it happened outside of the master narrative of history. And we have a sequence of women, all of whom are equated with zero, which is an absence of a quantity, that are visually set apart from the ever-progressing real time, which begins with year one and extends indefinitely into the future, okay? And these women, it's a family tree. So it follows 5 generations, 4 of which are generations of women from the same family, whose hopes we come to understand are foiled, both in Mexico and in the United States. So Angelica escapes the hoof-beaten storm to come to the United States, attempting to enter history and its promise of the American dream. But the dream is a progressivist hallucination, and her daughter, Sylvia, continues to struggle to move forward, to get ahead. And it's her daughter, Sylvia Vanessa, the author of the poem, born in the States, who says, I did everything I was supposed to do, and still an unbroken line of unbroken lines. And that's the italicized text here. Which demonstrates that this family, multiple generations of women, have been trying for years, decades, to enter real time. They want a future, but they don't actually get there until Vanessa gives birth to a son, Joaquin. And we see his life box is attributed to the quantity of 1, unlike all the women that came before him, who were 0. 1 being the beginning of his transition into real time, and it pierces the prime meridian of universal time and enters into history. So Joaquin is a generation in which the family secures a future. And his box reads, among other things, if someone is going to make it out of this dream alive, let it be you unbraiding from me. Let it be that this cord, its arcing line, when viewed from above, is a field. So cord and umbilical line is not actually a line, right? It's a field, she says. It's expansive and simultaneous. And if we're to go to the bottom right of this poem, back into real time, we have a message from Vanessa to her son Joaquin, which says, time was never a line, but a field, and you are occurring alongside the past, which collapses the distinction between past and present and asks us to think of time in a more nuanced, expansive way. And to briefly return to Lisette, who poses that for writers of color, the production of texts must also produce history, again, not in its capacity to facilitate some happening, but in its ability to raise a concealed world to the level of consciousness. I argue that this timeline, anti-timeline, which is really a field, the time and space field that Villarreal has crafted, raises to the level of consciousness a number of otherwise difficult to fully articulate, especially via linear narrative, which this paper inevitably must adopt for the purposes of presentation, experiences. So we have the multi-generational frustration, the resilience of hope that women have had for their children, for their daughters, despite all the hardships that they are forced to endure. And the self, the racialized self and the family against US and Western imperialism, and the ever self-affirming narrative of greatness and progress and opportunity that is espoused on the backs of the colonized and on the bodies and futures of those that it actively works to erase. And just as my final thing here, and to raise something to the level of consciousness is not to fully explain or understand it. It's not to solve something like an equation. Consciousness is a state of being awake or aware. And as I dwell and worry over this poem, I can't help but feel like it is tugging on something and leading me to questions that I hadn't thought about posing before. Okay, Fien.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Let's do our reactions. I mean, my camera's on, so I actually clap. Let's use reactions. All right. So Gemma Ludisaka will present her work, Drag Utopias, Reimagining Queer Memory, History, and Latinx Indigeneity.
Hi, everyone. All right, so let me share this real quick. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes, looks good.
Cool. Okay. Is it okay? And let me just grab my paper. Okay. I'm gonna also turn off my screen just because my internet really is terrible. So 1 second. Okay, I don't know. It's not, I don't see it. Okay. Yeah, so my paper is titled Drag Utopias, Reimagining Queer Memory, History, and Latinx Indigeneity. In Asegi Stories, Cherokee Queer and Two-Spirit Memory, Coley Driscoll uses the act of basket weaving as a metaphor and writing structure to explore the way embodied storytelling functions as a critical tool for remembering, retelling, and challenging the colonial imaginary and rendering of queer memory and history. As a point of departure, this study similarly considers the transnational and transhistorical practice of weaving amongst various indigenous cultures in relation to discussions of the third space, liminality, and futurity. For Driscoll, weaving points out the way the splinters or descent lines of the various woven materials used to make a basket meet in a way that illuminates a hidden third space in the basket. Similarly, the Andean concept of tingui also theorizes the existence of a third space. Andean weaving considers the way two thin threads may be joined to make a stronger one, or two different textiles or materials may be woven together to create a new novel creation. In all these different unions, tingui is additive in nature and marks the emergence of a third space. Utilizing weaving and tingui as a lens of analysis and writing structure, I propose a dialogical approach that considers the transnational flow and exchange of indigenous culture across the Americas by focusing on the embodied storytelling of self-identifying indigiqueer individuals whose indigenous ties are marked by diaspora or forced immigration. Driven by a need to recover, retell, and reimagine a lost history, this work also stems from the necessity to bring to light the often unacknowledged stories and mediations of indigeneity that occur in Latinx identity formation within a US context. What I suggest in bringing together all these various threads is the recognition of a hybrid third space that is visible only when we consider the contradictions, challenges, and questions that arise from mapping various cultural context zones that contribute to the creation of cultural memory. My aim in emphasizing this third space is to contribute to the continuous project of documenting new modes of history that draw from the collective memory of people and can only be made visible when we recognize and honor the splints that erupt from the intersections of various indigenous discourses. In order to do so, I argue that queer utopic spaces, such as the Latinx indigiqueer drag scene, challenge colonial histories and impose native subjectivities through performance. And in this way, the Latinx drag stage also functions as a hybrid third space that is symbolic of the way queer world building through drag connect native voices across time and space. So just a brief note on cultural specificity. Keeping in mind that cultural specificity is an important way of respecting different cultures and communities, I used Driscoll's methodological groundwork to inform my own study, noting their emphasis on embodied storytelling as a tool for highlighting other Indigenous-centered movements and intellectual genealogies. On the subject, Driscoll notes Andrea Smith's observations on multidisciplinary approaches. Smith writes, centering Native American studies as a starting point to articulate methodological approaches does not suggest that these approaches can be found only within the field. On the contrary, it provides us with an opportunity to see how the concerns of Native American studies intersect, overlap, and/or contradict other frameworks, demonstrating that Native American studies is part of a larger world that can inform and be informed by other intellectual approaches and methods. Furthermore, a multidisciplinary approach can account for the transnational flow and exchange of culture through materials that exist outside the colonial archive, and thus allow us to discern the way that subjects of transculturation often find themselves in third spaces. In this way, both descent lines and the concept of tinkuy can be understood as spaces that allow for the meeting of not only Cherokee traditions, but also other Indigenous communities, queer and trans studies, politics, and decolonial practices. Part of the personal investment that drives this research is the desire to recover my own lost Indigenous history, stories and names that have been buried by persisting colonial violence and theft. As a daughter of Indigenous immigrants, transculturation has rendered an entire part of my ancestral history incomprehensible. I remember putting fragments of stories and memories my parents shared together only to find these weird and strange when I couldn't see myself reflected amongst the shared experiences of my Latinx peers. It happened when I spoke words that I thought were Spanish, only to find that nobody else understood what I was referring to. Or when I was the only kid in my class wearing a brightly colored pollera along with a frilly shirt that made me stick out like a sore thumb. When I was old enough to understand that the reason my Spanish didn't make sense was because it wasn't Spanish at all, but actually remnants of a Quechua dialect, I also learned to appreciate how the pollera that I used to resent so much was the same one that my grandmother had worn as a kid, then passed to all her daughters, and after that, my older cousins, finally making its way to the States to me. Since then, I have attempted to recover, document, and stitch together what is left of my family history, trying to find a way to honor my archive and continue finding ways to reimagine the voids and absences caused by colonial erasure. Therefore, I was immediately drawn to the personal nature of Driscoll's work, who describes their methodological approach as, quote, I don't approach archival documents as a traditional historian looking for evidence of the past, but rather as a rhetorician, poet, and activist employing critical remembering as a way to retell stories and push against dominant histories. It is by small acts and insights that change occurs through the process of critical remembering. By broadening the parameters, pushing the boundaries to their extremes, we reach logical and often illogical conclusions. We begin to alter history. This idea that critical remembering can allow us to fill the void created by the absence of information and history resonates with me because it provides a way for us to explore the similar experiences of Latinx individuals in the US who don't fully belong here or there. Indigenous individuals who, because of immigration or diaspora, don't embody the dominant narrative of authentic or traditional Indigenous subjectivity. In Queer Latinidad, Juana Maria Rodriguez notes that no single term or construct can fully represent the historically marginalized subject, whose theoretical existence, insights, and ideologies have been, quote, thought out from the site of displacement, end quote. Therefore, an understanding of Indigenous subjectivity and identity must consider the different ways in which subjects employ resistant forms of self-identification. Rodriguez suggests such an understanding of identity and writes that, quote, identity is about situatedness and motion, embodiment and spatiality. It is about a self that is constituted through and against other selves in contexts that serve to establish the relationship between the self and other. The paradoxes and contradictions between subject positions move the subject to recognize, reorganize, reconstruct, and exploit difference through political resistance and cultural productions in order to reflect the subject and process. In this way, Rodriguez explores how discourses of difference and identity create knowledge about subjects and the way subjects speak back to create new bodies of knowledge, making the invisible visible. Identity is not only a response to culturally defined differences, but is continually engaged in unpacking stream of paradoxes and contradictions that inform the subject's relation to other subjects and the discourses that surround them. Focusing on this idea of making the invisible visible, I looked at the way queer aesthetics and performance are strategically used as a form of resistance and can contribute to the development of new knowledge about Indigenous subjectivity and identity formation. I specifically look at the indigiqueer drag scene in LA. By looking at different performances that disidentify from colonial structures, I posit that Latinx drag and aesthetics allow us to see the way indigiqueer drag performers have created a kind of counter-archive for renegotiating colonial history. Focusing on the way that stories are used as tools for remembering, retelling, and challenging the colonial imaginary and rendering of history, I argue that embodied storytelling, specifically through the act of drag performance, functions as a tool for the building of liberating and subversive queer spaces. The Instagram posts shown on these slides show two LA-based Latinx drag king performers that often create content and performances that explore indigeneity. As you can see, this is Sebastian, and he is your Mexican dead papi. He is showing the world with the dark side of life, that the dark side of life can be fun and nothing to be scared of. Sebastian's inspiration comes from his Mayan heritage and goth soul culture. You can find him lurking at the clubs and queer spaces. This intersection of Indigenous heritage and American goth subculture is just one example of how drag performers use the stage and how we can read their performances as a subject and process. And Utopia and Third Space, if we go back to Driscoll in Asegi Stories, they mentioned that their work has been informed by a lack of information about what it means to be Cherokee Two-Spirit in the present, and how this absence created a need for reimagining of stories that were witness to the lives of queer individuals, while also envisioning a radical decolonial future. They note that that queer utopian memory can be understood as a utopia that understands its time as reaching beyond some nostalgic past that perhaps never was, or some future whose arrival is continuously belated, a utopian present. More specifically, noting Driscoll's discussion of Gadugi as a methodology, we can explore the way in which Latinx drag scene functions as a space for queer world building. Driscoll observes that the concept and practice of Gadugi enables the continuation and survival of Cherokee communities. In this way, they present Gadugi as a central methodology to enable collaborative research amongst Indigenous communities. Driscoll writes that Gadugi has a critical relationship with performance as a means of survival and cultural continuance, and locates performance within cooperative communities. Gadugi provides an understanding for methodology that is collaborative, reciprocal, and surfaces out of community needs. Just as importantly, scholars in Native studies have called for radical political and scholarly alliances, both within and outside the field of Native studies. Noting the collaborative and reciprocal nature of Gadugi, we can begin to look at the way that Latinx drag scene functions as a kind of third space where queerness is mediated through performance in order to create a space where gender and sexuality can be reimagined and renegotiated. And looking at the Latinx drag scene as reflective of third space it is important to note the way that gender fucking and the act of lip singing enable the function of queer world building. Within the drag scene, gender fucking is commonly understood as a symbolic performance of gender and sexuality meant to highlight the way a performer's anatomy or sex is easily removed from gender semiotics. Within Latinx spaces, I would like to point out that observing gender fucking alongside lip singing simultaneously highlights the way queerness is mediated alongside Indigenous subjectivities. In playing a queer popular music identity and queer world making, Jody Taylor argues that lip singing is one way in which drag performers can, quote, subvert the body's borders If the voice produced in the act of singing reveals without choice an intimate truth about the performer's body, then a performance of lip singing reclaims the right of a performer to choose what they reveal about their bodies, and thus confounds this intimate physical truth. In essence, lip singing is this ultimate subversion of the vocally codified sex body, end quote. Noting Taylor's point that lip singing reflects the right of a performer to choose what they reveal about their bodies. And the following statements from a Latinx drag king form songs that allow them to explore aspects of their Latinidad alongside their queerness shows the way that the drag scene functions as a space to explore hybrid subjectivities that encompass the multiple intersections and complexities of negotiating indigeneity when some or all histories have been obscured. Additionally, the appropriation of popular songs traditionally sang by men brings queerness from the margins of popular culture into the center of discussion. The queering of popular songs in this way reclaims queer space and challenges heterosexual narratives that dominate popular cultural forms. More specifically, in reclaiming queer spaces within popular culture forms, the embodied stories of queer Indigenous voices can be amplified. In recognizing the existence of a hybrid third space within the Latinx drag scene, these images reflect the way two-spirit LGBTQ people are utilizing this space in order to promote uniquely Native-centered understandings of gender and sexuality. Most importantly, such a space allows for multiple subjective mediations of indigeneity, which ultimately shows how queer world building can connect all of these different Native voices across time and space. I couldn't end it any better than what Papi Churro said. I'm here, I'm queer, and two-spirit, get used to it. Thank you.
Fantastic.
Also,
Thank you
I
so
don't
much.
know if my presentation was like in full screen mode or not, and so I'm so sorry about that.
That's okay. I think we were able to see your awesome images.
Awesome.
All right, and now we'll have Philip Serrato with Juan Felipe Herrera's Cinnamon Girl and the Challenge of Entropy After 9/11.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be on this panel, and I'm grateful to all who have stuck around for this panel at this late hour on a Sunday night, no less. People have to go to work tomorrow and whatnot, so I'm hoping that I can pull my weight on this panel as we make our way into the later hours of the evening. Okay, so a little bit of modification to my title. It's called Broken Stems and Infinite Particles, Excess Entropy, and Juan Felipe Herrera's Cinnamon Girl Letters Found Inside a Cereal Box. As always, this is a work in progress. In fact, this is the sort of thing where, as I was finishing off this particular draft for this particular presentation, it occurred to me like, oh, I think I'm barely getting started now. So so bear with me as I work through some new things for a book that I'm working on. The terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001 left the United States in a state of ontological and epistemological insecurity. As Victor Seiler puts it in his book, Remembering 9/11, Terror, Trauma, and Social Theory, in the wake of the attacks, people in the United States, quote, recognized that somehow they were living in a world that had been radically transformed and would not return to what it had been before, end quote. Seiler then elaborates on the excessive ramifications of the attacks by explaining, by explaining, as life in the United States felt precarious and vulnerable in totally unexpected ways, people found themselves unable to take in what was happening before their very eyes. Not only was the myth of the invulnerability of US global power shattered by the events of 9/11, it was also difficult to live with the sudden feelings of vulnerability and the realization that there were not answers to many of the questions that were beginning to take shape as a result of the attacks. Along these lines, in trauma culture, the politics of terror and loss in media and literature, Ian Kaplan asserts that the attacks produced a profoundly changed populace. With the premise that trauma produces new subjects, Kaplan posits 9/11 produced a new subjectivity. Though not singular in nature, this new subjectivity was and remains a necessarily distressed one, due in no small measure to the speed with which everything unfolded. In the realms of politics and popular culture, this distressed subjectivity has taken different forms. all of them amounting to efforts to resolve feelings ranging from fear to anger and articulating not just diverse political, philosophical, and personal viewpoints, but also profound political, philosophical, and personal confusion. For this reason, Ann Keniston and Jean Felony observe in their introduction to literature after 9/11 that the devastation wrought by the attacks, quote, increasingly came to be understood and represented through a range of complex symbolic formations, end quote. Literature, of course, has proven a crucial venue for sorting out ideas and issues and feelings related to 9/11, with Christian Cloker even going so far as to contend that because of its brevity and task of finding an adequate language for what had happened, poetry was the first literary form to grapple with the events. Juan Felipe Herrera's young adult verse novel, Cinnamon Girl, Letters Found Inside a Cereal Box, which was published in 2005, enacts the capacity of poetry to depict and struggle with the assorted implications of 9/11. The text, which consists of first-person verse narration, journal-style poems, and the titular letters, centers on Yolanda Mondragon, a New Yorican teen who descends into a mental breakdown as she, like many after 9/11, suddenly experiences the world as entropically in the throes of flux, disintegration, and unintelligibility. Through content, form, and style, Herrera captures Yolanda's distressed subjectivity, particularly the tension inherent in her efforts to understand death, destruction, and radical contingency. These things are, of course, facts of modern life, and so endemic to modern coming-of-age experiences. In the wake of 9/11, however, these facts of life became even more acutely felt realities. With Cinnamon Girl, Herrera ends up thus crafting a 9/11 coming-of-age narrative. What is more, Herrera effectively advances a conceptualization of poetry as a medium for working out by slowing down otherwise overwhelming experiences and feelings. Sorry, lost my thought. Traumatic experience necessarily entails a swamping of the subject with information and feelings that they are unable to accommodate. And we see this in Cinnamon Girl as Yolanda struggles to compose herself in a seemingly and suddenly decomposing world. Ultimately, poetry affords Yolanda, Herrera, and the reader a medium for mediating the excesses that inhere in being in the post-9/11 world. The narrative of Cinnamon Girl turns on Yolanda's desperate wish for the recovery of her uncle DJ, an uncle with whom she is very close, but who was hospitalized in a coma after being trapped in debris on 9/11 when he tried to rescue others who were trapped beneath the Twin Towers. In the opening piece, Wrapped in Gauze, Yolanda describes the unnerving sight of her comatose uncle, in the process suturing the reader into not only her anguish, but also the sort of damage wrought by the attacks. Uncle DJ's wrapped in gauze. He dreams inside a foreign islita that no one has discovered except himself. There are congas under a tropical moon, gold nectar saxophones, and pale blue maraca stars. The galaxy spins and then fire bursts into a bird from San Juan, wings red as a flamboyant tree, and it speaks with the dark sentiment of the Caribbean night. Its eyes are aquamarine, and when it sings, green rain pours, and the soft island sways to a hip-hop mambo of amor, then adios. But I don't want to say adios. Tape across the mouth, hands strapped to the side of the hospital bed rails, IV and blood bottle lines tangled down to Uncle DJ's arm. A Darth Vader machine beeps every time he breathes through a sky-white see-through hose down his throat. Sweep my thin hand across the bed rail just in case there is dust gnawing around the chrome. In this segment, mortality and body horror become, with the Lacanian capital R, all too real for Yolanda. The strangeness of her uncle's state of non-being, the techno-crudity of the medical machinery used to keep him alive, and the uncanniness of the interface of this hardware with her uncle's body all demand of Yolanda accommodation of intensely unfamiliar feelings and realities. Notably, as wrenching as the scene is in and of itself, it assumes even greater poignancy when Yolanda explains what has happened. Uncle DJ swallowed enough dust, 2 buildings of dust, Twin Towers of dust. Last week, he called Mama Mercedes and said, "Hey, sis, gotta do something. I came to deliver roses as usual, you know. A jet or something hit Tower 1, a blast, and then another. Now I gotta do something. There's a fire and screams all around." That Uncle DJ was going about his ordinary work day, bringing love and beauty into others' lives by delivering roses for Rosie's roses, adds to the disorientation of the turn of events as the moral logic of goodness dissolves. With her uncle now comatose, with the world around her in disarray, and with all of this exceeding Yolanda's philosophical and cognitive tolerance, Yolanda takes on a manda or promise for the sake of her uncle's recovery. Look, Rezi, Yolanda tells her best friend at one point, you gotta help me find the others. Rezi, please, so Uncle DJ will live. By gathering and sorting into baggies the dust that is everywhere, and that is ostensibly the remains of those never recovered, Yolanda hopes to put 9/11 and its dead to rest and thereby earn recovery for her uncle. Yolanda's commitment to the manda emanates from a need for agency and the possibility of order amidst overwhelming disorder. We first see this sort of response expressed when Uncle DJ tells his sister in the aforementioned passage, I gotta do something. There's fires and screams all around. Fire and screams here signify not only terrible material chaos, but also terrible moral and semiotic turmoil. Yolanda's Thea Gladys gives voice to feelings of subjection to sudden helplessness when she asks Yolanda's mother while they are in Uncle DJ's hospital room, what's happening to my city? To the dismay of everyone, wishes for agency and answers only run into frustration. For example, in a journal entry for 9/24, Yolanda shares an experience at school. Everything has changed, Mrs. Camacho says. Things aren't all Julie's Naki, so cool, you know. You gotta do something. Are you listening? Take out your letters to the president, she asks us. Here we see a young person who is struggling with the assorted challenges of 9/11 bear witness to the struggle of an adult in a leadership role. Insofar as Mrs. Camacho validates feelings that everything has changed, all she can do is vaguely exhort her students, you gotta do something, anxiously insisting that they apprehend her words by querying, are you listening? That she follows all of this up by instructing students to take out your letters to the president comes across as a painfully weak gesture. What can one say in these letters? What good can these letters do? How can one begin to respond to 9/11? Such questions about the content and efficacy of the letters correlates with the challenges facing those working in arts and letters after 9/11. While a common line of thinking about 9/11 in literature is the one put forward by Richard Gray in After the Fall, American Literature Since 9/11, wherein he contends, if there was one thing writers agreed about in response to 9/11, it was the failure of language. The terrorist attacks made the tools of their trade seem absurd. Amy Pozorsky proposes in Falling After 9/11, Crisis in American Art and Literature, that the problem of reference is not that any language or word is inadequate to represent the trauma of 9/11, but rather that there is too much language, too many slippages of associations, too many possibilities for reading and misreading. The sort of problem that Pozorsky asserts arguably works contrapuntally with the excesses of 9/11 and intensifies the struggles of Yolanda to arrive at any cognitive control over her experience. In the poem Rumbles Down, for instance, Yolanda runs into an inability to mobilize an excess of language to speak her experience. Words in my head, I want to speak them, then they grumble, float to the ground, lift them up, that's all I can do now. Come on, lift them just like this. The problem of an excess of language is also acknowledged when Rezi brings up the matter of Yolanda's manic writing in the days after the attacks. I didn't put that one, sorry. Remember when you first came to school, Rezi asked. All you did was sit in the back of Mrs. Camacho's class and scribble scrabble. Rezi kicks my backpack. Who are you writing to? I don't know, I tell Rezi. After the towers went down, so many words came rushing out of me more than before. Open the backpack and show Rezi. As Yolanda concedes to struggling with gathering words and deploying them in a coherent manner appropriate to her experience and feelings, what emerges is a problem of emotional excess that is both caused and fed by semiotic excess. Such is why poetry about 9/11, be it Yolanda's personal pieces in the diegesis or Ededa's verse novel itself, emerges as an apt medium for engaging with 9/11. While Klockner's celebration of the ubiquity of poetry after and about 9/11 implicitly frames poetry as an accessible, in fact, democratic, potentially simplistic medium for multifarious and spontaneous expression, it is also, of course, the case that poetry is or can be an intricate art. While Ededa ostensibly portrays Yolanda in a state of disarray, He does so in a manner that allows for an organization of thoughts and feelings via mobilization of words. This is to say then, the poems and non-chronological texts may express post 9/11 entropy, but the text itself is not entropic. Consider, for instance, the stanza from the poem, "This Doesn't Need a Title." I want to see what is on the other side of the dust. To be sure, the spacing between the letters of dust captures the explosion of material and moral reality, and with it an expanding semiotic universe. But there is also a schematic gravitational tension holding the word together, allowing for a recalibrated form of coherence. Notably, a tension between deconstructive dispersion and keeping it together reflects Yolanda's vexed psychological state. Accordingly, the challenge for her is to accommodate herself to recalibrated ontological and epistemological orders. And ultimately, through Cinnamon Girl, poetry emerges as a powerful medium by which these orders can be recalibrated. By the end of the novel, as much as Yolanda and Rezi work to resolve the entropy of 9/11 by gathering and putting the dust voices to rest, they realize the impossibility of their commitment, which might ultimately be taken as an acknowledgement of the impossibility of ever being able to fully manage the semiotic excess produced by 9/11. There's too much dust to clean, Yolanda eventually realizes. With Pozorsky in mind, we can think about Yolanda's statement in semiotic terms, and thus as articulating the challenges faced by those working in arts and letters after 9/11. When Yolanda returns home, her mother attempts to help her cope with the excessive ways that she is perceiving and experiencing 9/11. Maybe the voices need to rest, Canelita, her mother tells her. You've carried them a long way. Mama and I open the baggies of dust. One by one, we pour them on the grass in a circle around a broken tree, thirsty and bitten. In this moment, Yolanda is guided to let go, not completely, but by stepping back and reperceiving 9/11 and its excess of meaning and death as part of a broader moral and existential and symbolic cosmology. This, of course, does not mean a forgetting or a healing over of all that the girl has experienced, nor does it mean an abandonment of the possibility of artistically or aesthetically giving form to experiences of excess. What comes across through Herrera's novel are the ways that poetry can mediate the excesses of life, serving as a medium for working through and organizing the abundance of thoughts, feelings, and language that we encounter as we attempt to strike truces with the experiences that erupt into our own lives. Thank you.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you, Philip. I'm sorry, I was writing down poetry to mediate the excesses of our own lives, because that's just beautiful. So yeah, I get one final round of applause for all of our presenters. I am so just thrilled by this panel. I guess before I start gushing, any of the panelists want to have anything you want to say, or anything from the audience? Well, I'll open up the chat, and then we can start the Q&A.
I am excited to share that I have a book list that I've created from this panel. I'm really excited to read these detective novels, but also I took down the Instagram handles and the Herrera book that I'm familiar with. So thank you for the titles. I'm really excited to dig in.
And actually, while you were presenting, Angelica, and did your proposal say you were going to talk about F-Root Future? Because I don't think I knew.
I don't know. I think I just said a poem from hers. But
yeah.
I'm writing about different poems of hers for my dissertation, but this is one that is always just on my mind. That kind of is like ancillary to my main project. But
yeah, I just put it in the chat, and I pulled it up while you were talking about it, because I just started teaching this first semester, and I was just obsessed with it. And then my students,
really? Oh, I didn't know.
Yeah, and then my student, it's an incredible poem to teach, and it's an introduction to literature class, so it's fantastic because it disarms students. They're like, wait, what? This is a poem? And we really they were so just, it just sucks you in. So it was just so great to see you talk about the importance of that. So yeah, everyone go get lost into this poem. Who else? What else? I guess I'll go ahead then and keep talking. I think something, and again, you see the titles and like they're kind of abstract. You're like, okay, that sounds good, but just once you see all of the work together, I think something that I love about this panel is just all the different genres, and I'm always interested in looking at genre, poetry, short stories, essays. I just and all the different overlaps. That I'm seeing, and again, I'm writing these, I wrote some things down and I'm trying to remember, like, wait, who said that? I think a couple people said that, right? Things about happening outside of a master narrative, counter narratives, reimagining, right? Recovering. I love that, Gemma, about recovering your personal archive, and just the costs of transculturation. It was fantastic. Embodied storytelling. This is just this is just what I love about being able to have conversations like this. So thank you all. Thank you all the scholars for bringing your work. Yeah, Michelle, go ahead.
So I have a question for you, Phil, because I'm just curious about the bigger project. Is it more focused on 9/11 works, or is it verse novels, or a combination of both? I'm getting ready to teach a verse novel in my children's lit class in 2 weeks, and I love the form. So anyway, you got me thinking more about it.
Oh yeah, thanks. So it's a book on what I'm calling an aesthetics of slowness in Chicanx children's literature. So I'm interested in the ways that we can situate different genres of work. So I talk about picture books, the Ediverse novel, and I put those in relation to kind of speed culture. So I used kind of different types of contemporary speed theory, like Franco Berardi, Paul Virilio. And I'm interested in the ways that these texts create slowed down experiences for processing and contemplating different kinds of sociopolitical realities. So with the idea that, what speed does is it ends up resulting in short-circuited cognition. I'm interested in ways that, like, photo books, the layout of photo books and the use of space compels a slowed down experience, and then kind of reading into, well, what are the implications of the content of those books, and when we have a slowed down experience with that content, what does that do? So that's why I just made a couple of fleeting references to speed and slowing down in this paper, so talking about the speed with which the events of 9/11 unfolded, and beginning to think through, well, how does Edda allow for a slowed down encounter with what is otherwise this kind of psychotically sped up kind of experience. So it's looking at the ways that slowness plays out, aesthetically in across a range of Chicanx children's text from the 1970s to the present day.
Are you by chance looking at Poet X in any way? Because I'm thinking as you're talking, when I taught that for the first time last semester, I had some students that complained that it was too slow.
Oh,
and
no.
Which I love it. I don't love the comment. I love the book, but I'm just thinking now, like anyway, now you give me a new way to frame it in terms of that conversation.
Oh yeah, no, I just meant, oh no, in terms of, I hadn't thought about that. I mean, that sounds terrific. So that's why, that's like precisely the type of argument that I would make, is that yes, slowness is deliberate, I'm even contemplating, like, in my introduction, do I try to say something cute about, like, low and slow as kind of endemic to Chicano culture, and how that's set off against this kind of fetishization and prioritization of speed in white American capitalism, right? So, discourses about progress, productivity, all of it is predicated upon an ethos of speed. And so what we find in Chicanx culture, but in the children's books that I'm specifically looking at is a kind of a counter ethos, one that prioritizes slowness, and that, and slowness working in a way that is not allowing for the objectification of Chicano culture. Because if you think about things like Slowpoke Gonzalez, in the Speedy Gonzalez cartoons, or the sleeping Mexican, the siesta, ways that brown people have been figured as lazy vis-a-vis slowness. So, kind of working against that and actually and reading slowness in this more generative sort of a way.
Great, thanks.
We have a question in the chat. One overlap I was fascinated by was the material objects, the embodied poem, clothing, bags of dust. I'd love to hear more about how the material contributes to the counter-historical. Yeah, great question, Madeline, thank you. Any panelists?
I think I can start, although I think that was more geared towards one of the other panelists in their analysis. But I think something that I think I didn't touch upon, but I think what brings all of us panelists together is I think that idea of going back to what is literature, what is the form, and especially like what is it that Chicanx and Latinx, right? What are their interventions to us rethinking what literature is, and more specifically the form, right? Because, Philip is looking at young adult and children's books. I'm looking at detective fiction. We're looking at performance and poetry, right? How are we presenting, what Chicanx and Latinx, their interventions are in the form, right? And when I talk about form, I mean form in the sense of literature, right? Poetry, anything that has to do, right? That composes literature, right? And for me, something that I didn't get to talk about, which is what my dissertation is about, is that the idea that the Chicano and Latin American authors that I analyzed and worked on in my chapters, they use the detective fiction, the hard-boiled genre, and the police procedural, all these different subgenres in the detective fiction as an intervention, right? Because when you look at the American hard-boiled, when you look at the whodunit, when you look at the police procedural in sort of the Edgar Allan Poe way, or in the kind of English way, right? They're all sort of under this kind of form of this idea that the form is linked to the nation, right? The form tells the story, the history of the nation, right? So I think when I look at all four of us, how are we, explaining and showing these authors as erupting that history, erupting that form, right? And for me, detective fiction, the way that I'm seeing the authors, right? Although it's not as big as kind of the poem, right? Where you see the visual and kind of the box is linear and then off way. I think in detective fiction, what Chicano and Chicana authors are doing and Latin Americans are doing is showing that, detective fiction isn't just a puzzle. Detective fiction isn't this accepted notion that society has an order, that society is good, and that it's different things that happen that make society go bad. No, instead, Latin American and Chicano, and maybe Latinx, I have to look more into it. They'll probably say, no, actually, society is already corrupt. Society is already corrupt. And what's making society corrupt are these large systemic things. It's the nation state. It's all of these processes that are being imposed on us, this systemic way of having us live. And we have to question that. And we have to reimagine crime as being the state, as being the nation state in some cases, and sort of think about, how do we retell that story so that folks will know that, we can't just accept this national nation, in parentheses, form. And I think, other panelists might have more to add to that, but I think like stepping back, that's the way I kind of see all of us coming together.
Okay, thanks, Beatrice. And to answer that question very differently in terms of like the material, is to say that when I first got to grad school, my head was like, theory was like everything had to start and end with theory. That was like the highest form of which I could possibly write. You know, it would always be theory forward. And then a couple of years in, I was like, but this doesn't bring me the joy of like looking and like holding a poem and like, you know, it, you know, the experience one has of like really stepping into like a piece of art. And so I think that the material to me is, I kind of switch things around. I'm like, no. Always I go to the thing first. The material thing then directs my theoretical framework. And even then, I feel like as I've continued to write, my theory, you know, my framing has gotten slimmer and slimmer. And I just find myself just wanting to like really just like dwell in the details of a poem or also visual art and performance, because I'm, you know, when I go home, after I see something, after I go to performance or I go, you know, look at an exhibit, like the thing that I'm thinking about at night is what it looked like, you know, like what, and I just imagine how these things like touch or feel like. And so I feel like the material has kind of become, you know, the thing that I work to through theory to talk about, to becoming the thing that organizes my thoughts, and that is the thought in and of itself. But it took a long time to get there. It took a lot of, you know, unlearning, you know, the academic, you know, expectation ladder. Yeah.
I think that's something that I can maybe segue into, especially this idea of how do you, you know, define something that has been defined by like a colonial archive or colonial narrative or history, right? And I think that you know, what you're saying about focusing on, you know, the material is something that I felt like I was doing with this project, because I'm looking at, you know, not only what it means to be an Indigenous person based on like what the colonial colonial narratives define an Indigenous person as, but instead what are the different kinds of history stories that we can use in order to kind of fill in those gaps and challenge this idea of you know, how do you define something when the language and the theory and everything that you're borrowing is tainted with that kind of like, you know, colonial influence. But yeah, I guess that's the way that I kind of see myself, engaging with this.
And I know part of the original question was about, well, I think what I'll do is I'll kind of literalize the notion of material. So like part of the question, the original question was about like dust and baggies, for example. And so, you know, with this particular chapter, I guess I'm interested in the ways that like, you know, dust ends up functioning as a kind of an image for the semiotic excesses of material reality. So, you know, there's this material reality around us. And so now, you know, how does one negotiate that without breaking down into, you know, without having some kind of epistemological breakdown where you just cannot grasp it, whether it's, you know, actual, you know, kind of physical, observable, empirical reality, or other types of material realities like police beatings or migrant deaths and things like that. And so, you know, so for like my own individual project, I'm interested in like, okay, so how does one slow down that experience? And one of the comments in the chat actually begins to speak to that. It's like, how do we slow down so we can process it, appreciate, understand it? But then also notice that there's this kind of a selection process and a filtering that's taking place. That's why I think it's interesting when Yolanda in Edetta's book, you know, she's trying to gather up this dust and put it into baggies. I mean, that's like trying to organize material reality that's just too excessive, right? But then eventually she realizes that no, there's too much dust. I can't clean it up. You can't fully manage it. So then what does she eventually have to do? Well, she has to kind of let go. She empties out the dust baggies around this tree, but that, like I mentioned, that's not a complete abandonment. It's more a matter of like, okay, so let me look at it from this other recalibrated perspective. And so it's about, you know, trying to confront realities, material realities. We're always trying to find kind of new perspective, new purchase from which to perceive them. And I think that's why, I think it was Beatriz mentioned initially, issues of genre and how we're all working with different genres. And that's what we see cultural workers doing, is turning to different genres, intervening in those genres and making them their own for the sake of being able to organize, speak to, capture these different types of social, political, material realities. And then and then reworking them so that we can capture, these kinds of other aspects that have been overlooked or denied because of the machinations of power, for instance.
Fantastic. And yes, and thank you for the comment, William. Good to see you. Hello. William and I were on the 20th Century Poetry panel earlier. William, you have got to check out the F-Root feature we linked to in the chat. I'm curious as to what you would have to say about it. But yes, I love your point about enjambment, right? That's the whole point of a line break. And yeah, speed reading, like what a violent concept, right? So yeah, slow it down. I agree, William. Anyone else with a comment? No, I think this is a pretty great way to shut Pamela down. We're like the last ones left in the hotel conference room. Everyone else is out doing what everyone does in Vegas. Okay, so the last thing to deal with is the electing next year's chair. Let me get into gallery view. I didn't even realize they did this. I feel like I think it's kind of weird to do it, but I guess this is how they do things. So is there anyone who would be interested in organizing next year's Latinx Literature and Culture panel as presiding chair? They do ask, UCLA is going to be in person, right? There'll be no virtual components. So the organizers do ask that you commit to all 3 days. It'll be Veterans Day weekend again. And it actually isn't that much work. And it was enjoyable because I got to read about all this amazing scholarship. So any takers? Gemma is your dog. Scholar.
Yeah, he says he'll do it.
He's like, yeah, it's fine. Okay, so I'll let Craig know. I will volunteer my services. If no one's opposed to that. I can understand if you would not want to say that now, but you can email Craig and be like, for the love of God, don't let her do it again. But hopefully everyone's okay with it. So yeah, thank you. If we were in person, I would go out and buy everyone a round of drinks. So hopefully y'all can go relax in some way. Congratulations on completing PAMLA. I'm on video saying I will buy you a drink at UCLA in a year. So we will hopefully reunite then. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. It was nice meeting you all. Have a great evening.
Thank you. Have a great one, everyone.